Okay, you guys, we're ready to get started. So if you could please take a seat. I want to welcome everybody today. Everybody that was here last month, welcome back. Those that are coming back for the first time, welcome back. And our guests, of course. Okay, first I'd like you guys to please silence your phones. Okay. You know, in this unusual year, we're doing things different month by month. As you can tell, if you were here last month, you didn't get your temperature checked this month. And we actually have tables with more than 4 seats. So masks are still required, and we're still doing social distancing, but we're leaving a lot more of it up to you, and who knows what it'll be next month. Normally, when we start a meeting, we start with a raise of hands for who would like to go to lunch. And of course, these aren't normal times, and can you all hear me now? Because last time I know I went in and out. Okay. Thank you for putting your smiley face on. So our lunch coordinators aren't coming to meetings yet, but I understand that there were quite a few people who did go to lunch last time, so I was asked to announce that if you would like to go to lunch, to head on over to the Black Walnut Cafe afterwards. Okay. Now I'd like to turn it over to Allison Johnson for our inspiration.
Limitless potential. What can you do to solve the problems of the world? You can start by being at peace with yourself. How can you make a difference in the overall scheme of things? You can offer a little kindness to the person next to you. Where will you find the answers to the biggest questions? By paying close attention to the smallest of moments. Is there any way to be confident and optimistic about the future? Do your best to live fully the opportunity of right now. Today, you find yourself connected to everything that is. Let that be enough. Let it inspire you to follow your highest possible purpose in every choice. Realize the limitless potential of what you already have with awe, with appreciation, with love. Live accordingly.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to introduce to you our speaker today, Nick Esthus, Senior Gardener at the Fort Worth Japanese Garden. His previous work experience includes Garden Curator at Memphis Botanic Gardens Japanese Garden, Chadwick Arboretum and Learning Garden at The Ohio State University, Nursery Intern at Longwood Gardens. He holds a degree in Landscape Design and Landscape Horticulture from The Ohio State University. Nick specializes in Japanese garden design, maintenance, and installation, both at the Fort Worth Japanese Garden and private clients. And Nick told me this morning he was at the Japanese Garden at 7 this morning. He gets there early. So we look forward to your program on Japanese garden design. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you all for having me. My name's Nick, and I'm here to talk about Japanese gardens today. And I thought the inspirational message there was very fitting for my talk. Is this too loud? Anyone think it's too loud? All right, good. You know, because in the Japanese garden, and in any garden really, it's all about being in the moment and really taking an appreciation for what's in front of you. So I thought that was very fitting for today. My talk today is on Japanese garden design and sort of what it's about. And I've sort of labeled it structured ambiguity, and it's a sort of a contradiction of terms, but I think what you'll find when you look at Japanese gardens and even Japanese culture, there's a lot of that sort of thing. This sort of juxtaposition of different ideas that might be sort of opposite of one another, and there's a lot of power in that, so I think that's what we'll come to find. I also want to preface this by saying we have an hour to talk about eons of information and experience. So I'm not going to be able to hit every single little thing, but I know that y'all will probably have some questions for me at the end, and maybe I can sort of hone in on some of your inquiries. So first thing I sort of want to talk to you about is this idea of fuzi, Japanese word obviously, but it's this idea of an overwhelming feeling, and it's aroused by the intimacy of things and the sensations of melancholic beauty which emanate from such fleeting emotions. So basically, this idea of awe-inspiring feeling in a space. So this picture here is actually in central Ohio, where I grew up, in a town called Marysville. It's outside of Columbus. And this is actually just on my way to my aunt and uncle's house, and this is before I started even getting into Japanese gardening. But this image struck me because I don't know, I just had this feeling about it. And basically, this is just an oats field with a drainage culvert going down through the middle, with the far off thunderstorm looming in the background. But if you start to look at the elements of the picture itself, you have essentially three colors and this curvilinear line going through it that's very harmonious for the space. And these are the sorts of things that we look to inspire us when we think about Japanese gardens. So if we take this image and we start to refine it a little bit more, this is actually from a park in Ohio, Hocking Hills State Park. It's in the sort of western part of the Appalachians, foothills of the Appalachians. And it's just a mountain or a stream going through, but you can see how one thing might be learned into the other, and how we can actually transfer this into the garden. So this is at the Cleveland Botanic Garden, and you can see that this is sort of a meandering stream, and there's a little bit more refinement. You know, this is nature, this is garden, and that's really what the essence of a garden is, you know, a space that we've decided to make our own and to make what we find inspirational. Another idea, this picture was taken in India. I went on a trip to India, into the Himalayas, and again, this idea of fuzi, this inspiring place that I was in. And these are all sort of ideas for me for future things, and that's what the gardener's work is. So if you take that, and has anyone been to the Portland Japanese Garden? For those of you who've been there, you know how it's a world-class place, and you can see that, you know, that obviously they didn't take inspiration directly from here, but you can see that sort of idea permeating into the garden. So let's talk a little bit about Japan, because that's obviously where Japanese gardens came from. Japan is an archipelago off the coast of Asia, east coast of Asia. And it's a very tumultuous place. A lot of things going on in Japan. It's seismically active, and a lot of different weather coming from it. And what that has done over eons and centuries of humanity there is that the people have a really deep appreciation of nature. Very deep. I mean, because they have to interact with it at all times. I mean, in recent history, we've had tsunamis, earthquakes, you name it. So they have a very deep appreciation of nature, and that really kind of comes through into the garden. Like I was mentioning, it's hard to see in this picture, but you can see he has the umbrella on. So most of these pictures, as a preface, came from a trip I took to Japan 6 years ago. I went to a workshop there and got to explore around a little bit, mostly in Kyoto area, but a lot of rain. So much different than what we have here. And a distinct sense of season, again, much different than we have here. You know, we have 2 weeks of winter and then summer for the rest of the year. So that's kind of where we're at. Probably the nicest people that I've ever met. Just very humble, very wanting to help anyone that it's in need, very friendly, and really a deep culture of a lot of things, arts, you name it. You can kind of see in the upper right-hand corner, that's I came upon this festival that was happening, and that's actually a Mikoshi, which we have one at the Fort Worth Garden, donated by our sister city. So this one's a little bit bigger, but they're carrying it up on their shoulders, and they're throwing it around up in the air. So it's a very, very inspiring place. So trying to get a little bit more of what's going on in a Japanese garden, I want to sort of set an idea that, just like in our gardens, things happen because of cultural events, religious things. So I wanted to touch on just a little bit of that in Japanese gardens, starting with this idea of Confucianism and geomancy that goes along with it. And I'm not going to speak on this entirely too much because it's mostly out of my league. Can anyone read this compass? Anyone read? No? Okay. But basically the idea is that in this geomantic process, geomancy, this kind of came out of Confucianism, which basically came from China. And what we'll see is that a lot of the ideas, if you know anything about Japanese history, a lot of the ideas actually came from China and Japan, Confucianism, and probably most importantly, Buddhism. But this idea is that like everything has a place, and you can see that there's sort of a map on the left-hand side, the cardinal directions, and then each cardinal direction has a distinction of an animal, a color, you name it. So that helped in the way of setting gardens. So this is the sort of layout of Kyoto, which is the old imperial capital of Japan during the Heian period, long period of time, about 1,200 years. And the leftmost photograph there is the overall layout of Kyoto, and the grid inside of it is the old imperial sort of square, if you will. Now Kyoto encompasses much of the dark gray is mountainous areas, and then the lighter is like the valley. You can see there's a couple rivers running through there. So the idea is that this was set on this north axis, pointing north is going up, so it's very cardinal oriented. And then as you zoom in, it's sort of all laid out as well. And this is all based on this sort of geomantic process. And during that time, they lived in these Shinden-style dwellings. And this is like a very, very old prototype of what a Japanese garden is, and its relationship with the architecture. That's a really important thing. So you would probably have a river or stream flowing through the garden, exiting out through the southeast quadrant, and that was very much related on all of that. So not as prevalent these days, but there's a lot of information and not really rules, but guidelines that sort of go into it that still sort of permeate into it. Another big influence is the idea of Shintoism, which is sort of Japan's sort of native religion, if you want to call it that. It's not really so much a religion as it is like a sort of a guideline for living in a natural sort of way. So it's very nature-based. And you would go, this is a shrine that I'm entering into, and this is a torii gate, which people are probably familiar seeing, but maybe don't have an idea of what that actually is. So a torii gate is basically a marker of a Shinto shrine. So if we were to see like a torii gate in a garden here in the U.S., it's sort of like putting a cross in a garden, which some might find, it's not like, it's a pretty specific thing. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to sort of be putting those things just in the garden without their proper reverence. So you enter in through there, and a big part of Shintoism and Japanese culture in general is this idea of cleansing oneself. So when you get to let me back up just a little bit. So this Shinto shrine actually is on a stream, a tributary that feeds into the water source for the city of Kyoto. So not only is it a sacred place that this water, this fluid of life, if you will, comes into where everyone is living, but it's also doing two purposes. It's recognizing that, then it's actually protecting that water source from any contamination, because there's this sort of church, if you will, on the grounds. So you enter into the shrine, and a big part of it is this cleansing yourself. So the idea that you have these water lavers, and you take a scoop of water, cleanse your hands and your mouth, and you put it back down, and then you're sort of purified to enter into the space. And you can see that going on here. And I mean, how cool is that rock with the, you know, with the water coming out of it? I mean, the craftsmanship to do that is pretty phenomenal. Again, this is another shrine at the temple there for the Shinto shrine there. And again, this is another one further into it, but this is sort of at the foot of the mountain, where the mountain meets the sort of valley floor, and so they sort of identify that with a shrine on there. And then sort of moving on into Buddhism, you know, Buddhism and Shintoism sort of share a lot of common values. But, you know, there's a whole lot I could talk about this, but I want to sort of get past that and get more into the Zen elements. But this idea of Zen Buddhism and what a Zen garden is, you know, it's sort of a misnomer in Western culture, because this garden is Weiho-in, but this garden is called Ryoanji, and it's probably the most sort of iconic Zen garden, if you want to call it that. And what makes this garden a Zen garden is that it's at a Zen temple. Not that it's a dry landscape, a Karasan-sui, as this is, but this is at the same temple. Is this a Zen garden? Is this what you have in your mind's eye as what a Zen garden is? So it's a little bit of a misnomer to be calling a dry garden such as this a Zen garden, when it really has no. Now this does, because it's at a Zen temple and it's maintained by the monks who live there, but like our garden at the Fort Worth Botanic Garden, we have a dry garden at Karasan-sui, but I wouldn't call it a Zen garden because it has no implication of being a Buddhist sort of tool. Another Buddhist temple we visited was Jikoen, and I wanted to show you some details of this. This is the approach in. So it's very, you know, it's obviously an approach into a special place, but it's also very sort of subtle and humble, which is what you'll find a lot of. And the idea, this is the threshold going through this gate here. We're stepping in from the world outside and entering into a very special place. And so the idea that there's one stone on one side and a combination of stones on the other, it's like you're leaving one place and entering into a new one. And it's these little subtle details that sort of help set the mood. So we walk in, and it's an automatic left-hand turn to go. So your vision is always not too far from you, at least into the approach of the garden. So we make our left-hand turn, and now we have a longer approach. Sort of this dark feel. It's a little bit darker on the screen, but it has intrigue. You know, you're drawn into the space. And also notice the detailed stonework here. This is what we call a nobanon, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we get to the end, and now we've reached our second gate. It's sort of like peeling an onion, you know. The further in you go, the stinkier it gets, but you know, we like the stink, so it's all good. So we've entered in through the garden, entered in through the gate and into the garden. Now our big reveal moment is at a veranda looking out into part of the garden. And it's sort of a poor picture, but this pine tree is in the foreground, and then you have a middle ground with the hedgerow, and then in the background is a view of the mountains of Kyoto in the background. Now, when this temple was, you know, first built or even going, you know, all the buildings weren't there. So it's this idea of borrowed scenery, and we call it shake. I won't really get into a whole lot, but the idea of taking the background of a space that is beautiful and enhances the garden design that's inside the garden. It's complementary sort of thing. So another big influence, again we're talking about Chinese influence because that's a lot of the way culture came to Japan, is from China and Korea. It's this idea of Chinese landscape paintings. So the landscape paintings were done by artists who would travel and look at all these inspiring views in nature and make these ink brush paintings. Now, Japanese gardens would then look at these paintings and try to recreate that. See how it's a little bit twisted, where usually in the original example, they're taking inspiration from nature itself, but the Japanese garden artist would take inspiration from the paintings and try to recreate that. So it's a little bit interesting. So we're going to talk about some garden concepts, and these aren't specific to Japanese gardens, but I've sort of tailored them into one garden here. This is Nichimurete, which is a abbot's quarter of the Shinto temple that we visited. So this is, you can see we're all gathered around, and you can see everyone sitting. That's a very common thing. And that's really the perspective that we want to look at, and that is the view from we were looking at. And again, I was talking about perspective. We're sitting, we're at a lower vantage. I mean, if you are standing like this and you change your height just a little bit, the perspective changes quite differently. So this is the picture of it from a crouch view and the standing. So you can see you're much more engaged in the space. So we'll talk about perspective, the planes and volumes. In nature, we don't really find rocks and plants all of the same size, so it's good to have a variance of that. You can see the big white rock there is really dominant in the composure, whereas and then you have sort of axillary and accenting plants and material around that. So there's a dynamic change of planes and volumes. Asymmetrical balance is a very big thing in Japanese gardens, whereas in more Eurocentric gardens where they have long alleys, these pleached hedges that are straight, long distance views. This is sort of opposite of that with the asymmetrical balance. The large whitestone is really offset to the left, and the pathway leading to the right sort of counterbalances that. So it's an indirect science that experience helps guide the way. Odd numbers, it helps to work with odd numbers. Now, I didn't count every single rock in there, and neither would a gardener, but if you're working like in small amount or small area, 4 is not really great because your eye sees the 2 and divides it into 2, whereas 3, you can't really divide 3 as in 3 pieces. You can't make one thing 1.5. So it makes it easier to do those sort of asymmetrically balanced things. The line of things, so there's a couple of different lines going on in here. It's the line of the pathway leading your eye into the scenery, back to that stone lantern, back into the mountain behind. And then there's also this hard line of it's not really concrete, but we'll call it concrete, going across the foreground. That sort of actually sets it as a framing. It's sort of like looking at a picture and looking back at the Chinese landscape paintings. That's what they sort of had in mind, is you're viewing the garden from a fixed position and looking at it like a picture. Whereas a lot of our gardens were engaged, including the Fort Worth Japanese garden, we're engaged in the space. We're looking at it from all vantage points. So that's a really big thing. Not all Japanese gardens are like that, but a lot of them are. A lot of contrast. You can see the contrast in colors, textures, shape, size, form, all sorts of things going on there. And really this idea of wabi-sabi. So wabi-sabi is sort of like rustic beauty. It's the patina that makes the Statue of Liberty green. It's a copper building, so it's the moss that grows on rocks over time. It's the cracking of the concrete around that first step. So it's sometimes hard for Western ideas to get around to understand this, because we want perfection. We don't want to see cracks, but where there's imperfections is actually usually the more opportunity for some sort of dynamic statement or some way to express an idea. So that's a really important thing, and it's really what makes the Japanese garden what it is. It's this thing that has this rustic beauty, and that's kind of where we're at with that. So I got these 10 aesthetic senses in the Japanese garden while I was in Japan. It was during a presentation, and I copied and pasted them into here from our presenter, but I thought they were good. So one is detail. Every detail of the garden is made with great care, and detail expresses the whole. And a good example of this is at a garden called Murian Inn. And this is a garden that was actually built later. It was actually built during World War I. Now, that seems like a long time ago, but when we're talking eons of garden history, it's really not that far. But when you start looking at this picture and realizing the detail that goes into this, it's pretty dramatic. So there's a large flat rock pretty much right in the middle of the photograph there. And it really has a special relationship with the mountain in the background. This is that borrowed scenery that we're talking about. Because the garden itself only extends to the row of trees in the background. After that, it's all Kyoto, but it looks like a natural mountain. There's a really nice relationship between the top of that mountain and the rock. It almost looks like they're having a conversation with one another. There's a relationship there. And then all the small rocks in the stream that create the little patterns in the water. That level of detail, setting out each little individual rock. Also, I'd be remiss to say that mention the 3 pine trees that are sort of in a row were very much pruned to enhance the view into the background, and then also the hedgerow behind it. I mean, there's a very busy road behind that. So that was all. This garden was sort of renovated by the garden company we were touring with. And all that was considered to create this view, to create this space and the feeling. So there's a lot of detail that goes into the garden. Being in season, the wholeness of the space is concentrated into every moment of the garden experience. So we're starting to see a little bit of that right now. I mean, we're sort of halfway through summer now? No, a little bit further, okay. But, I was in Japan, I think I was in September, going into early October. So, see, the color was starting just to change. And you can see that in the Japanese maple here, but also in the lower right-hand corner, that's a miscanthus flower, reedgrass. Very common pairing, especially around ponds in Japan, for this miscanthus grass and the maple, and it's very telling of the season. It feels like we're going into fall. So again, like I mentioned, Japan has 4 distinct seasons, just because where they're at in the world and all the climatic patterns that go around with it. Parallel arrangement of the elements or the details. Assembly of details with parallel relationship between their values. So basically, there's a relationship between all of the things that go into it, into the space. This is at Kinkakuji. It's a pretty famous garden. It's called the Golden Pavilion. Again, it's a Buddhist temple. I don't think it's a Zen temple. I think it's another sect of Buddhism, but you can see how the flat tops of the rocks sort of help parallel the flatness of the pine trees. And then also, like, the pine trees themselves are expressed all throughout the garden. So there's this continuity between not only the garden itself, but then also in the borrowed scenery behind. It feels like that it all belongs, and it really does. But it was all very much intentional in the garden. Signs of nature. Japanese architecture is articulated with different degrees of signs of nature from the outside. And these are precisely controlled by either a fusuma or soji screen, basically a sliding door, somewhere where light is be able to penetrate into that. And there's different degrees of ambiguity and continuity and discontinuity. So this is a little bit of a reflection of that, whereas the architecture itself is imposed on the garden, whereas what I was just discussing, the garden would actually usually be imposed on the architecture with a shadow of leaves on a screen. But this is where the sun is passing through a part of the architecture, and it's illuminating this sukubai arrangement, this water basin. This would be a spot where you do your cleansing sort of thing. And this is very intentional. I mean, this sukubai was arranged here because the light pattern came in through at such a time of the day where someone might be using this. So it was very intentional use of that. And this idea of ma is very important. It's like your interval. It's just like relationships between a person, a suitable distance or an interval between materials is important to create a spatial harmony. Ma is the space necessary for this harmony. We have a little bit of a different sense of that in these days, I think, having to keep our social distance and everything. But it's important because it's not only in gardening itself in the garden, but it's also our interactions with one another. In music, it's the time or distance between notes. And dancing, it's the time and space between your dance partner or different moves. And in the garden, this is at I believe this is a Zen garden, a Buddhist temple, and this is a Ryojinin. And this is what they call a subonima. It's a little small garden in between like two different spaces and a little courtyard of sorts. Very small garden. It might be 8 feet wide by 20 feet long, but it has a lot of power in it. And the power comes from the space between things or the lack thereof. And what you can see here is that it's pretty well divided up, more or less even, but if you take away the lines, you don't see that, but there's a lot of power in that. So the space between things is very important. And in some cases, it's more important than what the thing actually is. Excuse me. Hiding. Repressing instances and hiding part of it gives viewers freedom of imagination. Therefore, the expression tends to be ambiguous rather than clear. So it's like, what's behind that gate? I see through the gate. I can see that there's something beyond it, but not all of it. And that's really important to really engage the participant, to engage the guests into the space. And really, it's really your eye, because I don't think that you're actually able to walk through that part of the garden as a guest, but your eye travels into that space. The path is leading towards that gate, which obviously it would because it's a path, but you only seen part of it, so that's a very good technique to create some energy in the space. They're primitive. Japanese attitude toward nature is not to put humans standing against it, but to be in harmony with nature as part of it. The attitude is to accept and appreciate nature as it is without manufacturing it. So it's a little muddled there, because they're saying that it's to appreciate nature as it is, but we're in a garden, so it's a little bit different. It's a space that we have carved out for ourselves to express nature. And I thought this picture in Koto-in was a pretty good representation of that. If you look, it's all natural materials. We have a bamboo hand railing, there's wood post, there's stone. Now some of the stone is cut stone, but it's that ambiguous line between humanity and nature. There's straight hedges, but beyond the hedges, there's this wild grove of bamboo. So it's sort of walking that line between nature and a garden. Quality is really big in Japanese gardens. The quality of your materials, the quality of installation, the inherent taste of material. This is in Zuiho-in. So this, I showed a picture earlier, but I wanted to show you this stone because you can see the top of it is white. So it reminds me of like a snow-capped mountain. And if we start sort of looking at this as a landscape rather than a garden itself, you can imagine that maybe this is a mountainous region with either a lake or the ocean being the gravel and the moss being some sort of forest. And so the attention to detail and the quality is very important. The idea of deconstruction. Now, it's not to say that we're tearing down gardens, but the idea of deconstruction, or called ha, is a break through the existing flow of things and make it transform into a new flow. It really helps to sort of create tension and dynamism in the landscape, in the garden. This is a Ryogenin, and this is a Karasansui, which is a sort of a dry garden. So a lot of the times Karasansuis are representational of water, but not necessarily all the time. It's a way to do a garden without water. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you can see that the gravel has been broken up a couple of different times, but not only the boulders, but this very prominent circle of moss. And that's that sort of, it almost looks like it was like an ink drop plopped on a piece of paper and sort of spread out. So it really, the contrast between the moss and the gravel really helps to create this very powerful scene. The idea of courtesy. That's a really big thing in Japanese gardens. And I feel that's one of the things that is very much lost in gardens here in the U.S., Japanese gardens here in the U.S. The idea that you're sharing this space with others, and that it's a special place. So I get sometimes frustrated when I hear a lot of chatter and just people playing music in the garden is really annoying, because I really just want people to experience the garden in and of themselves. So in Japan, this is in Suihoen. This is a picture I was mentioning earlier, but it's kind of hard to see, but we all have our shoes off, and we're all being quiet, and we're all taking in the space. The shoes thing is a Japanese thing. I mean, if you enter into a home or dwelling, you take your shoes off. I mean, it's just sort of a practical thing. You're not dragging dirt and such in. But also, it's a help protect, the veranda itself, this wood veranda. And it's just the idea you're being courteous entering into this space. So I'm going to digress a little bit and talk a little bit about Japanese garden elements. And a big one is the idea of the rocks or boulders, or ishi. This is in Ryoanji. And you can see that this boulder has a very much mountainous shape, very sort of rough and rugged, is what we would probably describe as a new rock. It hasn't been worn down, as opposed to rocks that are found in the stream. It has smooth edges. So the designer of this garden used the specific rock to sort of give the idea that maybe this is a mountainous sort of feeling. And again, as we go in, this is a sort of a better picture of that. You can really see that like there's this high cascade into the mountains and leading down to the ocean, and the raking of the gravel really makes that feel that way. And probably one of my favorite gardens that we visited there was Nijo Castle, and you can see the boulder placement all throughout the garden. Now, just remember, this is all man-made. This is not a natural setting. All of this was put there by the garden designer and his team of gardeners. Kind of hard to see from the distance that we're at, but a lot of the rocks have flat tops. That's what we call the timba, the head of the rock. And what that does is just sort of help carry that idea. It's an arrangement of the elements. It's this idea that we're carrying this idea through the entire garden. And the sort of middle left portion of the picture is a bridge spanning across the water, and it sort of reflects that idea as well. So just and there's rocks of all sizes, just a really good example of stone placements in the garden. Another element is sand or gravel. You can see the raking here in Ninaji. It's a pretty prominent Buddhist temple in Kyoto. And I want to point out that the raking, it's pretty straight, but at the same time it has that sort of waviness to it, because the monks are going, it's hard to really keep a straight, trust me, it's very hard to keep a straight line when you're raking. Very hard. But that's that sort of wabi-sabi. We would want to see like perfect lines, but that little bit of variance is really kind of what makes it special. This is Ginkakuji, the Silver Pavilion. This is a pretty famous garden as well. You can see in the background there, or in the back foreground, if you will, there's a pile of sand there, and it's been shaped like Mount Fuji. So it's this idea that the garden designer was inspired by Mount Fuji. How can we bring this idea of Mount Fuji into the space? Well, let's create this gravel or sand representation of it. And again, this is all sorts of different rakings, you can do it, but a very common garden element. And this is at the Kamigano Shrine. This is at the Shinto Shrine. And this is a very prevalent thing at Shinto shrines, where there's these piles of sand. And it's actually usually spread during, if an important visitor has come. It's an idea of like to purify or cleanse the space. You put this fresh layer of gravel down, and then when it's over, you pile it back up and you clean it again. So used in a lot of different ways. Niwaki, garden tree, probably my favorite. I love pruning trees, and I prune a lot of trees, so it's sort of my favorite thing about Japanese gardens. So this is a Japanese white pine, and I would say it's probably, I don't know, 600 to 800 years old. And you can see all of the bamboo latticing underneath it to sort of help keep its form. There's a lot of care that goes into the garden itself, but into trees. The trees are probably the most important part, and pine trees especially. You know, on any given tree, it's either pruned once or twice a year, and it's very, very meticulous work. It's a lot of work. I would say that this tree would probably take, if it was one person doing it, this tree would probably take at least a week to do. But usually there's several gardeners working on it. Another example, this is a Japanese black pine, Pinus thunbergii, which is kind of the quintessential tree in a Japanese garden, if you will. This is all one tree. Everything that you see in the lower plane there, that's all part of that central tree. You can see the support that goes into giving these trees, and the ramification of the branches, and that all comes from the pruning process. The pruning process is to keep the trees growing in a particular space, but it also gives the tree the character that we come to see in Japanese gardens. And the pine trees are really good examples of that, because you see this beautiful branching. Now, not all trees are treated the same. This is on the Kyoto Imperial Palace, and the picture on the left is a tree that is very large. It's probably 60 to 70 feet tall, and it's very much more natural looking, whereas opposed to the trees on the right, they're very much more clipped. So that's that bud clipping that happens in the spring that really tightens it up. It's almost like shearing, but doing it very much more very much more on point. Just another examples of beautiful trees. I'm a tree geek. I love pruning trees, so that's sort of my thing. Karakomi, or clip shrubs. This idea of shearing shrubbery. A lot in Japan, it's usually azaleas, actually, which that's not really a thing here. But the flowering of the azalea in Japan is like just sort of a bonus for karakomi or clip shrubs. It sort of just comes on in the spring, and it's usually about the time you start shearing. So usually we're cutting out a bunch of flowers. But this is a picture of some karakomi in Portland Japanese garden. This is in Jiko-in. You can see the size of them can be very large. Now that's not necessarily azalea there. I don't know exactly what that is, but they use a lot of different material. For us, my favorite is dwarf yopon holly. Works really well. I cut ones that are this tall down to the ground. They reflush to a third of the height within that year. So they're very, very tough. Really good for us. So koke, or moss, is very prevalent in Japanese gardens, at least in Japan. You know, moss isn't really a thing here for us in Texas. In the Japanese garden of Fort Worth, they use Asian jasmine, and I shear that. In Japan, they just pick weeds and brush off the moss. So it's really not so much moss, but it's the ground plane. That's sort of what we're talking about and how that's represented. In the garden in Fort Worth, I string trim the moss. I do it about 3 times a year. I'd like to do it more often, but kind of a one-man show right now, so 7.5 acres is a lot to take care of. So this is in Kotoen, and you can see the wabi-sabi of the space, the repetitive cleaning. And when I say cleaning, they're just using a bamboo broom to clean off the moss. You know, depends on the garden, but daily. And that's how you sort of get these worn areas and some areas that are a little bit more lush. Again, the wabi-sabi of the space. Ginkakuji, you know, while I was there, actually, there was a crew of guys out there picking up little bits and pieces as they go. So it's pretty beautiful. It's actually a really important part of the garden, and you can see the naturalness of the space with the moss sort of accentuating the root system of the trees. Miso, or water, very big part of Japanese gardens. That, you know, water has this reflective quality to it, so it makes a dynamic statement in the garden. Again, at Kinkakuji. Now here it's more of like a lake or ocean setting. You know, again, Japan is archipelago, so there's a lot of ocean scenery. So this might be, and the black pine grows on the shores of the ocean. So this would be a pretty representational shoreline view of Japan. Now, but if you go deeper into the mountains, you get into a mountain stream, and it's a little bit difficult to see on the screen here. But there's actually a 3-tier waterfall coming from the stone arrangements in the back. And again, that's that sort of hiding thing. We're not seeing all of the waterfall at once. We're seeing a little bit here, a little bit here, and a little bit here, asymmetrically balanced, leading further down into the stream. As farther you go along the stream, the more subtle it becomes, like a mountain would be, right? You have the mountain with more waterfalls coming fast, and then slowing down as you get further down in the stream. It's kind of like us. You know, we're fast and vibrant when we're young, and then when we get a little older, we start to slow down. And again, so we're at Mirianen here. This is the head of the stream, the head of where the mountain is there of sorts in the garden, and then this is further down the stream, same garden. Again, we're slowing down. You can see how much wider the stream is. Sort of like, think of the example. I came from Memphis before I was here, so I think about the Mississippi. You know, the headwaters in Mississippi all the way up in Minnesota. You know, it probably has more of a feeling like this, but in Memphis we get more of a feeling of this big, expansive piece of water. Nobidan, or pathways through the garden. Very important. Not only are they getting you places, but they help draw you into the space, and we talked a little bit about that before. But what I wanted to mention about them is what they're made out of. It can be stone, which it most commonly is. Sometimes it's rammed earth or clay, concrete of sorts. It's not really exactly concrete, but it's more or less what it is. But then also the design of it. So I say shin so shin is like informal. So the material is informal, but the design is very much formal. So it's very straight with straight lines on the edges. Whereas this pathway is a little bit, it's called a gyo sho so. So like the pathway itself is sort of formal because it's straight, but it has these sort of rough lines. But the material that it's made out of is a combination of cut stone and natural stone. So it's sort of in between. And then you have more of what we call stepping stones, throughout the garden. This is a very sort of informal pathway leading through the garden. So again, this is all very intentional. It's what the gardener, the designer, wanted you to feel. He wanted you to take distinct steps to get to the rock, the next rock in front of you. And what that does is makes your eye look down at the ground plane and notice all those subtle details in the moss, in the gravel, all those sorts of things. So it's a very intentional thing. And though the way that they're laid out and how they complement one another is very important. Stone lanterns, Ishidoro, probably one of the more known things about Japanese gardens for people who aren't really experienced with them. They actually came out of a very purposeful place. They're used in Buddhist temples, and they would illuminate them at nighttime if they had like a tea ceremony or some sort of special venue or happening going on, or even just to illuminate the garden at night. And that's what they were used for. Nowadays, they're more used as an accentuary piece and like sort of like a statuary sort of piece. But you would most likely find them where you would find lanterns in the garden, along pathways, along views that you wanted to illuminate. Anywhere there's a change of direction in a pathway or something that you need to see at nighttime, you would typically find a lantern. So as a garden designer now, we would look for those places, and that's where we would situate a lantern. There's a lot of different styles of lanterns, and each style sort of has a different place in the garden. This is a Yukimi lantern, very much more upright, formal style lantern. Whereas there's other ones that belong more like along coastlines or ponds. So the base is called the kiso, the seo is the pedestal, the chudai is the platform that the hibukuro, the light box, sits on. The kasa is on top, and the hoshu is on the very top. It's the finial. I know that you guys are going to remember all of that, and it's really important. But the most important thing is that they actually did come out of a useful place, but now they're sort of used more artistically. So gaki, or fence, a lot of times they're made out of bamboo. And a lot of the names for the types of fence actually came from the grounds that they were built on. So this is at Ryoanji, and that type of fence is called Ryoanji gaki. So that's a common reference for a lot of different types of fences. And this sort of fence here would be, it's like a barrier fence, keep people out, people walking in there. This is at the Portland Japanese garden. This is the Yotsume gaki. This is like probably the very common sort of fence, just straight up and down bamboo with going across. And it's sort of like, if you compared this is like, okay, really stay out of here. This is okay, it's a little bit more inviting. Very rustic. This is at their tea house at the Portland Japanese Garden. So tea is a very rustic sort of a ceremony, so we wanted to be fitting of that space. And at Genkakuji, this is Genkakuji gaki. So, and then at Koto-en, this is a little sleeve fence, and you see that a lot. Just to sort of, again, that hiding aspect that we want to work with. Sukubai, water basins, we've seen some of that. Again, it's that sort of purification sort of ceremony, and there's a whole thing with that. But I'm sort of running out of time, and I appreciate you guys listening to me. While I have your attention, though, I wanted to bring some things to your attention at the Fort Worth Garden. So, I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but we are now all under the Botanical Research Institute of Texas, BRIT. We share a campus with them right on University there. So this is our new branding. It's an elm leaf with both sort of the photosynthetic properties of leaves represented on the top path, and then the sort of the veins more on the brown sort of part. And I think that's a good representation of the sort of the living collection at the garden, and then the more research and based and other part at BRIT. I wanted to share with you just a few things that are going on, and all this is available on the website, either at Brit.org or fwbg.org. We have some Bonsai 101 coming up, Fragrant Winter Blooms, the holiday herb, some sort of holiday herb. Again, I'm just showing you what they gave me. Fall into Spices, and then some photography in the Japanese garden and sketching in the Japanese garden. Now this is kind of cool. This is a We Dig Bio transcript Brits. So if you want to sort of be part of a globally active thing, this is sort of where you want to be. You can join Brit's Armchair Botanist program and the worldwide event to help liberate over 200 years of botanical information from herbarium specimens. So really cool, kind of cool thing that happening here in North Texas that is a worldwide thing. And another thing, this is a brown bag lecture series, and this the commonness of rarity. So again, all of this stuff is available on our line, but I really hope that y'all can come and visit us. We got a lot of new and good things happening at the garden, and look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you all very much. Oh, anyone have questions? I guess we're doing question and answers, or we have time? So any questions? Yes?
I wanted to say there's a real interesting novel, Garden of the Evening Mists, which is about the building of a Japanese garden. It's a novel, but anyhow, if anybody's interested, it takes place in Malaysia.
Okay, yeah, and there's it's kind of a point that there's a lot of garden reference in other books. The Tale of Genji, which is one of the earliest Japanese novels, if you will, gives a lot of reference into what garden life was like back then. Because if you think about it, people, when these gardens were starting to be built, it was all aristocrats, all people with means to do this. So there's a lot of culture, a lot of art. So there's, I could only just touch the surface of things today. So it's really interesting to see that part. Yes, sir.
I think a quick question is, how do you keep the gravel from things growing in the gravel? How often do you have to go back and redo it?
Yeah. I think you know the first answer to that question. He's got to get out there and take care of it. In our garden, the dry garden, I do get a little bit of weeds. I just get out there and pick it. And the second part of that answer, as far as how often do I do it, it really depends on the time of the year. Summer is typically a little bit slower. Things aren't falling down off the trees as much, so I can usually get away with a little bit longer. But typically, it's anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks. Now, I'd love to be able to do it more often, but kind of don't have the person power to be doing that.
Well, I didn't know whether they had some sort of plastic or not plastic, but something to prevent it.
It certainly can, when you go about making it. Our garden does not. A lot of the times what you'll see is that there's actually just concrete below it, and then a good 6 to 8 inches of gravel. And what that allows you to do is actually scoop up all the gravel at an interval, 10, 15 years, whatever it is, and clean all the gravel out, because there is accumulation of detritus, essentially. Anyone else? Ma'am?
I have a black pine that's about 30 years old, and how do you get that horizontal plain look in the black pines? Is that trimmed, or is that just a natural?
Well, okay, so the whole idea with trimming trees is to make them look old, right? Old trees will tend to have these flatter branches. Now, how does that happen? Because we all know that a plant is going to search for light. It's growing up and out, right? But it keeps putting all this growth, all this growth, all this growth, all this growth. So the weight of the branch itself is what actually makes it flat in old age. But if we want to transfer that into the garden, what we do is we prune out all the very vigorous upright growth. And what you'll see on your black pines especially is pines grow in whorls. Probably everyone's familiar with that, but they have a prominent central bud, and then they have buds at a whorl around it. So we'll cut out that central bud and cut out any buds that are growing on top of the branches or they're real vigorous. Encourage the buds that are called lateral buds and make those grow out. And basically, if you have a central bud with 2 lateral buds, you take that out, you're going to have 2 buds growing like that. And they're going to become your new leaders, if you will. So you keep doing that over the years, you can see how the branching starts to really fill in like that. So by pruning out the vigorous growth and promoting the sort of subordinate growth, you get that flat feeling. Yes, ma'am.
Nick, what's your secret to no footprints in the sand?
I actually I levitate. No, it's just you just walk backwards, and you kind of erase it as you go. Anyone else, ma'am?
You don't see a lot of flowers in Japanese gardens. Is there a reason for that?
So, I mean, I think your question is valid, but it's also like that question is based on our version of what a garden is. Like, you know, we want a rose garden, or we want a lot of annuals in our garden. Well, in Japan, it's not really a thing. You know, they're very much more appreciative of the naturalness and beauty of nature. So when you do see flowers, it's very much in the season. It's in the moment. I sort of talked about that being much in the season. So azaleas in the spring, hydrangeas in the summer. I think I'm up against it here, so I want to thank you all again, and I was happy to come out here. Thank you all so much.